Who's responsible for this failure? Is the neocons in the United States? Is the Israeli lobby in the United States? The Israeli government, who has a lot of leverage on Washington? How do you find the balance of power when it comes to the Middle East?
That was a question I posed to myself when I started writing the book. And I tried all kinds of pathways to reach an explanation via an Occam's razor, if you will, explanation that would be concise and simple and yet comprehensive enough to give me a general idea of what's going on here and why is it so difficult to move ahead. And why is it that things seem to be getting worse, even though we're talking about the countries that have got the bulk, most of the US economic and military aid in the past 50 years. And prior to that, the role of Britain, the role of France, and other great powers in the region. So in the fall of Israel, I went back to the idea of there being four major structural forces that account for a series of cumulative disasters in the Middle East. I call them the Great Conjuncture, because I don't think that it's a perfect storm. Perfect storms are possible in mathematics. We humans are imperfect, so we create imperfect storms, and this might be one of those. But it is a confluence of different kind of forces. And I think that the key trigger in all of this has been the waves of Palestinian expulsions since the late 1947s. This precedes the state of Israel and creation, 1948. Whichever way one looks at this crisis, one always comes back to this. Even I personally wasn't aware of the full weight of this factor until the 1980s, when the so-called Israeli new historians were able to access the declassified files in Israel and take another look at the past history. Prior to that, though, Palestinian historians had made it very clear that these expulsions happened, but they had been ignored to a large extent. Why? Because they didn't have the kind of voice that the historians of a sovereign nation would have. And they were considered to be partial, not academic enough, not knowledgeable enough. But they had a point because they had access to people who suffered the bulk of these expulsions, the Palestinians. On the Israeli side, historians like Benny Morris was able to show how critically the events of 1948 have to do with what goes on in the present. The son, ex-member of Shin Bet, I think, Israeli security, and accomplished soldier himself, the son of Moshe Shareb, the first foreign minister of Israel, used to call it the original crime, these expulsions. And I think that one really has to go back to that far to understand what is going on here. The second aspect of this all, and if I may add, with the expulsions, I think really it was the work of Ilan Pappé around 20 years ago. His work made it very clear that it was not just the net effects of war, as Benny Morris would have it. He pointed out that in war, bad things happen. Ilan Pappé was able to show that there were objectives, there were intentions, there were collectives actively creating these goals early on, 1930s and 40s. And I talk about those a lot in the book. Second aspect of the Great Conjuncture, if you will, would be the excessive expansion of these Jewish settlements in the Palestinian occupied territories. This started already in the late 60s under the Labour government, if I may add. And that, I think, was one of the greatest mistakes that the Labour government did in its first decade after the Six-Day War. My dear friend, whose books I once translated, Amos Oz, the great novelist, called them the neo-Nazis already in 1967. There were others who saw quite clearly where this would take people. Yad Dayan, the daughter of General Moshe Dayan, whom I met around 1973, and who was then already active in peace movement and later became one of the peace activists, just as Amos Oz became the co-founder of Peace Now, a movement that I've supported ever since then. They saw what was coming, and other Israelis as well, but they couldn't stop it when the government allowed it to happen. There was a so-called Igala loan plan that aimed still at national security, and the hope was that there would be some kind of a settlement, two-state solution, if you will. But somehow that was ignored, because on the one hand, there was this talk about Alon plan, but it was never taken forward by the Israelis, and it had a lot of aspects that would have not been agreeable to many Arab countries and certainly to Palestinians. But at least there was an effort to that direction. Things changed dramatically with the election of 1977 when the Likud government, what I called hard right or harsh right, came into power. Now, this is not your normal right-wing movement. Of course, there were elements of free trade, free markets, and so on and so forth. And they had, in some areas, certain points. The Labour government had allowed too many monopolies, not enough competition, not enough market-led initiatives. But these constraints were turned upside down. When this government came in, this cabinet came in by Menachem Begin, what we saw was, on the one hand, the rise of neoconservative economic policies, but on the other hand, a very aggressive state-led effort to support these Jewish settlements. So much so that in the early 1980s, some people, like the deputy mayor of Jerusalem at the time, Ben Minister, said that, have we reached the point of irreversibility? Are there so many settlers in the West Bank that we can no longer reverse the course of history? We have to live with this. The reality is that those settlements could be removed. They were removed in 2005. They could be removed now. That's a political issue, not a military issue. They are a hindrance to peace. Israeli organizations, think tanks like Malad, have shown how so much of the government budget goes to subsidizing the settlements and the settlers, and so little actually to Israeli protection. It has turned upside down this relationship, which is very dangerous to Israel. What has made this, I think, still more problematic is the rise of Israeli far right in the last elections, 2022 in the fall. Now, when I protested these settler movements, those were Gush Emunim, Ma'ale Adumim site in 1974 and 1975 when they were created. But at the time, there were 3,000 to 4,000 settlers, I believe. Now, settlers claim that including Jerusalem, there might be more than 800,000. And that's not far from the truth. So there is this messianic far right now in the government. In the book, I argue that it's a bit of a situation like you let the foxes into the hen house and you look what happens next. Well, we know what happens next. The people that were considered to be criminals, if not criminals, quasi-criminals, still decade 2 or 3 ago, are now making decisions, administrative decisions about the fate of the settlements. This has led to anti-Arab pogroms, which I find are not that different from those waged conducted against the Jews more than a century ago. And I'm not alone in this. There are Israeli generals who agree on it, and I have been on the record on that. There are Israeli leaders, ex-leaders of Mossad, Tamir Pardor, in the forefront, who have argued that Israel is constrained by apartheid rule in the occupied territories.